Greenwood Hills, Ohio, was the kind of place where life moved slowly, where neighbors exchanged polite greetings over fences, and where whispers traveled faster than cars on the winding streets. It was here, amidst the charm of small-town America, that Ethan Miller and Emma stood hand in hand on a crisp autumn afternoon, exchanging vows in front of friends, family, and a town that had seemingly blessed their union. Ethan, 26, was the pride of Greenwood Hills, a hard-working, salt-of-the-earth kind of man. He'd grown up here, shaped by the love and sacrifice of his father, Richard Miller. Richard, a stoic yet kind-hearted mechanic who owned the town's only auto repair shop, had raised Ethan alone after losing his wife years ago. Though their bond was built on quiet resilience rather than outward affection, their connection was unshakable. Richard had spent his life teaching Ethan about hard work, loyalty, and sacrifice, lessons Ethan carried with him into adulthood. Standing beside Ethan was Emma, 21, with a radiant smile that seemed to light up the cool Ohio day. She was a newcomer to Greenwood Hills, having left behind a bustling city life for the promise of love and stability. Emma had been enchanted by Ethan's sincerity and steadiness, qualities she found grounding in contrast to her own free-spirited nature. She imagined their life together would be a beautiful journey, filled with laughter, family, and the kind of love that could weather any storm. But storms often gather quietly. As the newlyweds settled into their modest home on the edge of Greenwood Hills, life initially felt like a dream. Their house, with its quaint front porch and sprawling backyard, seemed to hold the promise of endless memories waiting to be made. Ethan, however, quickly found himself consumed by his job at a construction company in Cleveland, 2 hours away. Long hours and exhausting commutes left little room for the quiet moments of togetherness Emma had envisioned. She filled her days decorating their home, planting flowers in the backyard, and dreaming of the family they would one day create. Yet, with each passing week, the silence in the house grew heavier. Ethan's absence began to weigh on Emma. Greenwood Hills, with its sleepy charm, started to feel less like a retreat and more like a cage. The streets, though picturesque, seemed too empty, the neighbors, though friendly, felt too distant. Her dreams of a vibrant, shared life were dimmed by the reality of her loneliness. Ethan, ever the provider, was blind to the cracks forming beneath the surface. To him, every late-night shift and long drive was a step toward securing their future, a future he believed they both wanted. It was during one of those long, solitary afternoons that Richard began stopping by more frequently. At first, his visits were brief, a quick repair of a leaky faucet or help with a stubborn lawnmower. But over time, they grew longer. Richard, 50 and still strong from years of manual labor, found a quiet comfort in helping around the house. Emma, eager for company, welcomed his presence. They would share coffee at the kitchen table, exchanging small talk about the weather or the latest town gossip. Yet, beneath their easy rapport lay something unspoken. Richard saw in Emma the vitality he hadn't felt since his wife's passing, a spark that stirred something long dormant within him. Emma, on the other hand, found herself drawn to Richard's steady demeanor, a kind of presence she craved but couldn't find in Ethan's absence. The storm had begun to brew, though neither of them realized it yet. In Greenwood Hills, where appearances meant everything, no one could imagine the secrets that would soon begin to unravel. By the time the new year rolled in, the once bright glow of newlywed bliss had dimmed in the Miller household. Ethan's job at a construction site in Cleveland demanded more of him than ever. Early mornings turned into late nights, and weekends, once reserved for their shared plans, were swallowed up by overtime shifts. Every hour Ethan spent commuting to and from the city seemed to widen the emotional chasm between him and Emma. Emma, still adjusting to the quiet rhythms of Greenwood Hills, found herself alone more often than she'd anticipated. Her days were filled with mundane tasks, tidying the house, preparing meals Ethan was often too tired to eat, and staring out the window at streets that rarely saw more than the occasional dog walker. She tried to fill the silence with hobbies, even considered joining a local book club, but none of it seemed to erase the gnawing loneliness. Ethan, oblivious to her growing isolation, saw his long hours as a necessary sacrifice. He was building their future, or so he believed. He didn't notice how Emma's laughter, once so easy and infectious, had grown quieter. How she avoided eye contact during their rushed dinners. How the warmth in her touch seemed to have cooled. It was during one of those long afternoons, with Ethan gone and the house too quiet, that Richard stopped by with a toolbox in hand. The back door was sticking again, and Emma had mentioned it casually over Christmas dinner. True to form, Richard showed up unannounced, ready to fix the problem. "Didn't mean to bother you," he said, stepping inside and wiping his boots on the mat. "Thought I'd get this door sorted before it drives you crazy." Emma waved him off with a smile. "You're never a bother, Richard. Come in. I'll make some coffee." The back door took all of 10 minutes to repair, but Richard lingered for another hour, sipping coffee at the kitchen table while Emma recounted a funny story from her childhood. It was the kind of easy, light-hearted conversation that had grown scarce in her life. Richard listened intently, laughing at her jokes, and for the first time in weeks, Emma felt truly seen. After that, Richard's visits became more frequent. He always had a reason: a creaky cabinet, a leaky faucet, a lawnmower that needed tuning, but it was clear he enjoyed Emma's company as much as she did his. They found comfort in their conversations, which grew more personal with each visit. Richard shared stories of his youth, tales of the adventures he and his late wife had once dreamed of but never taken. Emma, in turn, spoke of her struggles to adapt to the slower pace of Greenwood Hills, her dreams of exploring the world, and the loneliness that sometimes crept in during Ethan's long absences. "Must be hard, him working so much," Richard said one afternoon, his voice filled with quiet understanding. Emma hesitated before replying. "It is. I know he's doing it for us, but sometimes I wish he were just here." Richard nodded, his eyes softening. "I get it. It's not easy being alone. Sometimes, even when you're surrounded by people, you can still feel it." That admission hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Richard wasn't just talking about Emma's loneliness, he was speaking of his own. The years since his wife's death had been long and empty, and for all his efforts to stay busy, there was a hole in his life that nothing seemed to fill. Over the weeks, their conversations deepened. They talked about regrets, unfulfilled dreams, and the unexpected twists life had thrown at them. Richard was careful never to overstep, but he found himself drawn to Emma in ways that unsettled him. She was vibrant, intelligent, and kind, qualities that reminded him of the man he used to be, before grief had dulled his edges. For Emma, Richard was a lifeline. His steady presence and unflinching support filled a void Ethan didn't even realize existed. She told herself it was harmless, a friendship, nothing more. But there were moments when she caught herself looking at Richard longer than she should have, noticing the strength in his hands as he worked, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. The shift between them was subtle at first. A brush of fingers as he handed her a coffee mug. A fleeting glance that lingered a second too long. Each moment was small, insignificant on its own, but together they formed a thread of connection that neither of them dared to acknowledge aloud. By the spring of 2019, Richard's visits had become a routine. Ethan, unaware of the growing bond between his wife and father, was grateful for Richard's help around the house. He often thanked his father for keeping Emma company, and never noticed the awkward pauses or stolen glances that had begun to fill the air between them. Emma told herself she was overthinking it, that her growing fondness for Richard was nothing more than gratitude for his kindness. Richard, too, tried to dismiss the way his heart quickened when Emma laughed, convincing himself it was innocent. But in Greenwood Hills, secrets had a way of slipping through cracks. And though neither Richard nor Emma realized it yet, they were already standing on the edge of a line that once crossed, could never be undone. By the time 2020 rolled around, the cracks in the Miller household were no longer invisible. Ethan, still tirelessly commuting to Cleveland and back, was drowning in work, often too exhausted to notice the tension brewing at home. To him, life was a series of checkboxes: pay the bills, secure a future, make sure Emma had everything she needed. What he couldn't see was that what Emma needed most was his presence, something that seemed perpetually out of reach. For Emma, the loneliness had become suffocating. Greenwood Hills was as quiet as ever, its streets seemingly frozen in time, offering no distraction from the emptiness she felt. Her once busy mind now lingered too long on thoughts she knew she shouldn't entertain. Richard's visits, initially an innocent reprieve from her isolation, had become something she looked forward to, a bright spot in her otherwise monotonous days. Richard, too, had begun to feel the shift. He told himself he was just being kind, that helping Emma was a way to stay connected to his son's family. But deep down, he knew better. Every time he crossed the threshold of their home, he felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of vitality, of being needed. It was intoxicating, even as guilt began to gnaw at the edges of his conscience. The defining moment came one chilly February afternoon. Richard had come by to fix a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, but the work was quickly forgotten as he and Emma found themselves sitting across from each other at the dining table, a cup of coffee between them. The conversation was easy at first, small talk about the weather, the neighbors, the mundane details of small-town life. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the tone shifted. "You know," Emma said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, "sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake moving here. Not marrying Ethan, I love him, but, this place, this life. It's not what I thought it would be." Richard set down his coffee, his brow furrowing. "What did you think it would be?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice tinged with a wistful sadness. "Something more. Something fuller. I thought being married would fill the empty parts of me, but sometimes I feel like I'm lonelier now than I've ever been." The words hung heavy in the air, and Richard felt his chest tighten. He recognized that loneliness, the kind that lingered even when surrounded by people. It was the same ache he'd carried since losing his wife. For a moment, he considered saying something comforting, something safe. But when he looked into Emma's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own pain, and the words spilled out before he could stop them. "I know what you mean," he said. "It's like, you're walking through life with this hole inside you, and no matter what you do, it just stays there." Emma looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Exactly," she whispered. It was an innocent exchange, but the intimacy of the moment was undeniable. Neither of them acknowledged it aloud, but something shifted between them that day. What had once been a friendship grounded in mutual respect was now tinged with an undercurrent of something deeper, something neither of them dared to name. As the weeks passed, that connection grew. A lingering glance here, a brush of hands there, each small gesture felt like a step closer to a line they both knew they shouldn't cross. But it wasn't until late March, during one of Ethan's overnight shifts, that the unspoken finally gave way to action. Richard had stopped by after dinner to help Emma move a heavy planter in the backyard. The task was quick, but the conversation that followed stretched long into the evening. As they stood on the porch, the fading light casting long shadows across the lawn, Richard reached for Emma's hand to steady her as she stepped down from the last stair. The touch was brief, but electric. When she didn't pull away, he let his hand linger, his thumb brushing gently against hers. "Emma," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, "I." But before he could finish, Emma closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was at once tentative and charged with years of suppressed longing. The moment was fleeting, a stolen second that ended as quickly as it began. Emma pulled back, her face flushed with a mix of desire and panic. I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping back. "I shouldn't have." Richard shook his head, his expression conflicted. "No. I should go." He left without another word, but the damage had been done. That kiss, though brief, was a breach in the dam, and the waters of their restraint were beginning to overflow. Both of them knew there was no going back, yet neither could fully grasp the consequences of what they'd set in motion. In the days that followed, the tension between them was palpable. Richard avoided the house, staying late at the auto shop, while Emma tried to convince herself that it was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment. But no amount of rationalizing could erase the memory of that kiss or the feelings it had stirred. By May, their restraint finally crumbled. What began as a series of fleeting touches and stolen glances escalated into something undeniable. They crossed the line they had danced around for months, and in doing so, bound themselves together by a secret that would soon become too heavy to bear. In Greenwood Hills, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. And as the summer of 2020 approached, the whispers began. Mrs. Carter, always watching, had noticed Richard's visits becoming more frequent, more intimate. And though she couldn't yet put her finger on what exactly was happening, she knew one thing for sure: something wasn't right in the Miller household. By the time 2021 began, the weight of their secret had begun to bear down heavily on both Emma and Richard. The intimacy they shared, once exhilarating, had turned into a quiet, gnawing guilt. Every touch, every lingering glance, every stolen moment was now shadowed by the growing fear of discovery. They told themselves repeatedly that it would end, that they could bury the past and move on, but the pull between them proved impossible to resist. For Emma, the guilt was most acute during the evenings when Ethan came home exhausted from work. He would collapse onto the couch, asking about her day with genuine interest despite his obvious fatigue. His trust in her was absolute, unwavering, and it made the lies she told feel like daggers in her chest. At the dinner table, as Ethan talked about plans for their future, she couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. She found herself hyper-aware of every word, every gesture, terrified that some slip might betray her. Yet, it wasn't just guilt that haunted her, it was longing. Her connection with Richard had awakened something in her that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the physical relationship, it was the way he listened to her, the way he saw her in a way she felt Ethan no longer did. And then there was the child. When Emma discovered she was pregnant in the summer of 2021, her world tilted. The joy she might have felt was drowned out by a wave of panic. She hadn't been keeping track of dates, but the timing left a chilling possibility: the baby might not be Ethan's. The thought alone made her stomach churn, but what terrified her more was the prospect of anyone finding out. Richard, when told the news, reacted with a mix of quiet dread and hope. He didn't ask outright if the baby might be his, but the unspoken question hung heavy between them. "Whatever happens," he said one evening, "we'll do what's best for the baby. For the family." But neither of them dared to define what that meant. As the pregnancy progressed, the tension in the Miller household became palpable. Ethan was ecstatic about becoming a father. He threw himself even harder into his work, determined to provide the best life possible for their growing family. He didn't notice the way Emma flinched when he talked about baby names or how she grew distant when he placed his hand on her belly. For Ethan, everything seemed perfect. But perfection has a way of inviting scrutiny. By mid-2022, whispers had started circulating in Greenwood Hills. Mrs. Carter, ever watchful, had begun to piece together a narrative from the fragments she'd observed. She noticed how Richard's visits to Ethan and Emma's home had increased during Ethan's long hours away. She saw the way Emma's eyes lit up when Richard was around, and how he lingered in doorways longer than necessary. To the neighbors, it might have seemed like nothing more than a doting father helping his son's young wife through her pregnancy. But to Mrs. Carter, it was something else entirely. Ethan, too, had started to sense that something was off. It wasn't one big revelation, but a series of small, unsettling moments. Emma's demeanor had changed, she was more reserved, more withdrawn. There were moments when she seemed lost in thought, and her responses to his questions felt hollow, rehearsed. Then there was Richard. His once easy relationship with Ethan now felt strained. Their usual weekend lunches or impromptu chats at the auto shop had become rare. When they did happen, the conversations were stilted, filled with awkward pauses. The unease reached a breaking point one afternoon in August 2022. Ethan came home early from work, his shift unexpectedly cancelled. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Richard's truck parked outside. It wasn't unusual for Richard to stop by, but something about the sight unsettled him. He entered the house quietly, stepping into the living room where he found Emma and Richard seated at the kitchen table, their heads close together, their conversation cut short the moment they noticed him. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice careful. "Didn't know you were stopping by, Dad." Richard cleared his throat, standing quickly. "Just helping Emma with the sink. It's been acting up again." Ethan nodded, but his eyes lingered on both of them. Emma avoided his gaze, busying herself with tidying up the counter. Something about the way they both seemed flustered made his stomach tighten. Later that night, lying awake beside Emma, Ethan replayed the moment in his head. The way Richard had left so abruptly, the way Emma had seemed on edge, it wasn't the first time he'd noticed it. And once the thought had planted itself in his mind, it began to grow. In the weeks that followed, Ethan became more observant. He started noticing things he hadn't before, how Emma would grow tense whenever Richard's name came up in conversation, how she seemed to watch the clock when he was expected to visit. He began paying attention to the little details, the way Richard's eyes would linger on Emma just a moment too long, the awkward silences that filled the air when all three of them were in the same room. The breaking point came one evening in late September, when Ethan stumbled upon a crumpled piece of paper while cleaning out the garage. It was a letter, written in Emma's handwriting but addressed to Richard. The words were vague, filled with phrases like, "We can't let this ruin everything," and "Ethan can never know." Though it didn't outright confirm his suspicions, it was enough to set Ethan's mind racing. That night, as Ethan sat alone in the darkened living room, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. The stolen glances, the tension, the letter, none of it made sense unless he was willing to confront a possibility that chilled him to his core. The people he trusted most, the ones he loved more than anything, were hiding something. And deep down, Ethan already knew what it was. By the start of 2023, Ethan Miller was no longer the man he used to be. The suspicion that had taken root in his mind the previous year had grown into an all-consuming obsession. His days were spent going through the motions at work, but his nights were restless, filled with dark thoughts and unanswered questions. Every glance, every word from Emma and Richard seemed layered with hidden meaning, feeding his paranoia. The crumpled letter he had found in the garage was tucked away in his desk drawer, a silent reminder of the betrayal he feared but had yet to confirm. Emma, meanwhile, had grown increasingly anxious. She noticed the way Ethan watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his questions seemed more pointed, more probing. Her once warm and affectionate husband now felt like a stranger, a man cloaked in quiet anger and suspicion. Richard, too, had become distant. He rarely visited anymore, finding excuses to avoid the house. When he did stop by, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The tension finally came to a head on a cold December evening in 2023. Ethan had returned home early from work, determined to confront Emma. He had spent weeks replaying every moment, every interaction, every fragment of evidence he'd gathered. The doubts, the lies, they were too much to bear. He needed answers, and he was prepared to demand them. Emma was in the kitchen when he walked in, her back to him as she prepared dinner. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, watching her, his heart pounding in his chest. He thought about the life they had built together, the love they had shared, and the future he had once believed was so certain. But those thoughts were quickly eclipsed by the memory of that letter, the stolen glances, and the growing distance between them. "Emma," he said, his voice low but firm. She turned, startled by the sharpness in his tone. "Ethan, you're home early." He didn't respond to her smile, didn't move closer. "We need to talk." Emma's hand stilled, her expression shifting to one of unease. "About what?" "About you. And my father." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Emma's face paled, her lips parting as if to protest, but no sound came out. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "I found a letter," he continued, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "A letter you wrote to him. Do you want to explain what it means? Or should I?" Emma's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But the weight of the truth was too much, and the cracks in her composure finally gave way. Tears welled in her eyes as she sank into a chair at the table, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Ethan stared at her, his fists clenching at his sides. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Emma? Tell me. Say it." "It was a mistake," she sobbed. "It started when you were working so much, and I was alone all the time. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan, but it happened. And I didn't know how to stop it." His chest tightened as the words hit him like a physical blow. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What happened?" Emma's sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. "Richard and I, we were together. I didn't mean for it to go as far as it did, but it did. I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry." Ethan's world shattered in that moment. The room seemed to tilt, the ground beneath him crumbling as the truth he had suspected but dreaded was laid bare. He staggered back, his hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. "And the baby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he mine?" Emma's silence was answer enough. The confrontation didn't end there. Fueled by anger and heartbreak, Ethan stormed out of the house and drove to the auto shop, where Richard was locking up for the night. The confrontation that followed was raw, filled with shouting, accusations, and bitter confessions. Richard tried to explain, tried to apologize, but Ethan wouldn't hear it. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too fresh. "You were supposed to be my father," Ethan spat, his voice cracking with emotion. "How could you do this to me?" Richard's shoulders sagged under the weight of his guilt. "I never meant to hurt you, Ethan. I swear. It just happened." "That's not good enough," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "You destroyed everything. Everything." By the time the confrontation ended, Ethan was a shadow of himself. He returned home briefly, but the house that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a prison. Over the next few weeks, he withdrew completely, leaving Emma and the child to fend for themselves. He quit his job, stopped answering calls from friends, and spent his days locked away in the small apartment he rented on the edge of town. By early 2024, the weight of the betrayal had become unbearable. On a quiet January evening, Ethan wrote a letter to the child he had loved as his own, pouring out his heartbreak and his hopes for the boy's future. "You are innocent in all of this," he wrote. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. I loved you with all my heart, and I still do. But I can't be here anymore. I can't carry this pain." The next morning, Emma found the letter on her doorstep. Inside, the words of Ethan's anguish were written with heartbreaking clarity. She read it through tears, realizing too late the full extent of the damage her choices had caused. Ethan's body was found later that day in his apartment. The news sent shockwaves through Greenwood Hills, leaving the small town to grapple with the fallout of the Miller family's tragic collapse. For Emma and Richard, the consequences of their actions would linger far longer, haunting them for the rest of their lives. By the start of 2023, Ethan Miller was no longer the man he used to be. The suspicion that had taken root in his mind the previous year had grown into an all-consuming obsession. His days were spent going through the motions at work, but his nights were restless, filled with dark thoughts and unanswered questions. Every glance, every word from Emma and Richard seemed layered with hidden meaning, feeding his paranoia. The crumpled letter he had found in the garage was tucked away in his desk drawer, a silent reminder of the betrayal he feared but had yet to confirm. Emma, meanwhile, had grown increasingly anxious. She noticed the way Ethan watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his questions seemed more pointed, more probing. Her once warm and affectionate husband now felt like a stranger, a man cloaked in quiet anger and suspicion. Richard, too, had become distant. He rarely visited anymore, finding excuses to avoid the house. When he did stop by, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The tension finally came to a head on a cold December evening in 2023. Ethan had returned home early from work, determined to confront Emma. He had spent weeks replaying every moment, every interaction, every fragment of evidence he'd gathered. The doubts, the lies, they were too much to bear. He needed answers, and he was prepared to demand them. Emma was in the kitchen when he walked in, her back to him as she prepared dinner. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, watching her, his heart pounding in his chest. He thought about the life they had built together, the love they had shared, and the future he had once believed was so certain. But those thoughts were quickly eclipsed by the memory of that letter, the stolen glances, and the growing distance between them. "Emma," he said, his voice low but firm. She turned, startled by the sharpness in his tone. "Ethan, you're home early." He didn't respond to her smile, didn't move closer. "We need to talk." Emma's hand stilled, her expression shifting to one of unease. "About what?" "About you. And my father." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Emma's face paled, her lips parting as if to protest, but no sound came out. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "I found a letter," he continued, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "A letter you wrote to him. Do you want to explain what it means? Or should I?" Emma's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But the weight of the truth was too much, and the cracks in her composure finally gave way. Tears welled in her eyes as she sank into a chair at the table, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Ethan stared at her, his fists clenching at his sides. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Emma? Tell me. Say it." "It was a mistake," she sobbed. "It started when you were working so much, and I was alone all the time. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan, but it happened. And I didn't know how to stop it." His chest tightened as the words hit him like a physical blow. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What happened?" Emma's sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. "Richard and I, we were together. I didn't mean for it to go as far as it did, but it did. I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry." Ethan's world shattered in that moment. The room seemed to tilt, the ground beneath him crumbling as the truth he had suspected but dreaded was laid bare. He staggered back, his hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. "And the baby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he mine?" Emma's silence was answer enough. The confrontation didn't end there. Fueled by anger and heartbreak, Ethan stormed out of the house and drove to the auto shop, where Richard was locking up for the night. The confrontation that followed was raw, filled with shouting, accusations, and bitter confessions. Richard tried to explain, tried to apologize, but Ethan wouldn't hear it. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too fresh. "You were supposed to be my father," Ethan spat, his voice cracking with emotion. "How could you do this to me? Richard's shoulders sagged under the weight of his guilt. "I never meant to hurt you, Ethan. I swear. It just happened." "That's not good enough," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "You destroyed everything. Everything." By the time the confrontation ended, Ethan was a shadow of himself. He returned home briefly, but the house that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a prison. Over the next few weeks, he withdrew completely, leaving Emma and the child to fend for themselves. He quit his job, stopped answering calls from friends, and spent his days locked away in the small apartment he rented on the edge of town. By early 2024, the weight of the betrayal had become unbearable. On a quiet January evening, Ethan wrote a letter to the child he had loved as his own, pouring out his heartbreak and his hopes for the boy's future. "You are innocent in all of this," he wrote. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. I loved you with all my heart, and I still do. But I can't be here anymore. I can't carry this pain." The next morning, Emma found the letter on her doorstep. Inside, the words of Ethan's anguish were written with heartbreaking clarity. She read it through tears, realizing too late the full extent of the damage her choices had caused. Ethan's body was found later that day in his apartment. The news sent shockwaves through Greenwood Hills, leaving the small town to grapple with the fallout of the Miller family's tragic collapse. For Emma and Richard, the consequences of their actions would linger far longer, haunting them for the rest of their lives. The morning Ethan's body was discovered marked the beginning of an unrelenting silence in Greenwood Hills. The kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air, palpable and oppressive, as though even the wind dared not disturb the morning. His death was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning. The town, once filled with the quiet routines of small-town life, now became a place of hushed whispers, stolen glances, and unspoken judgments. For Emma, the news came with a weight that she would carry for the rest of her life. The letter Ethan left behind, folded neatly and placed on her doorstep, became both a relic of his love and a monument to her failure. She read it over and over, her hands trembling as the words bled into her mind. "You were my world, my everything. I gave you my trust, my heart, and my dreams. I wanted nothing more than to build a life with you, a family, a future. But the truth you hid has shattered me. I love my son, but I cannot bear the weight of knowing he might not be mine. Please tell him I loved him, always." Emma's sobs echoed through the house as she clutched the letter to her chest, her mind spiraling through memories of happier times. She saw Ethan smile when he had first held their son, his unwavering determination to provide for their family, and the way he had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. And now, because of her actions, that love was gone forever. Richard, too, was left to face the unbearable consequences of his betrayal. The knowledge that his actions had driven his son to the brink and beyond left him hollowed out, a shell of the man he had once been. When the news reached him, he shut down the auto shop immediately, locking the doors and pulling down the blinds as though doing so could keep out the weight of his guilt. But guilt, as Richard soon learned, cannot be shut out. It seeps in through the cracks, a constant presence in every thought and every breath. Greenwood Hills, for all its small-town charm, was not a forgiving place. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading like wildfire. Mrs. Carter, the ever-vigilant neighbor, was the first to voice what many were thinking. "It's no wonder, really," she told a friend over coffee. "All those visits, all those whispers. People like that always get what's coming." Emma could feel the judgment in every passing glance, every polite but distant smile. She couldn't go to the grocery store without overhearing murmurs or seeing the way people avoided her gaze. The once close-knit community now felt like a courtroom, with Emma perpetually on trial. The house she had once dreamed would be a haven now felt like a prison, every corner haunted by memories of Ethan. By March, Emma made the decision to leave Greenwood Hills. She packed what little she could carry, leaving behind the home she and Ethan had shared, the friends she had hoped to build a life with, and the town that would never let her forget. With her son in tow, she moved to Los Angeles, seeking anonymity in the sprawling city. But even there, the guilt followed her. In the quiet moments, after her son had fallen asleep, she would sit alone with Ethan's letter, tracing the words with her fingers as tears slipped silently down her face. Richard, on the other hand, stayed in Greenwood Hills. He couldn't bring himself to leave, though he rarely left his own home. The auto shop, once bustling with life, remained closed, its tools gathering dust. Richard became a recluse, avoiding the town and its people, finding no solace in solitude. Every corner of Greenwood Hills was a reminder of Ethan, his laughter as a boy, his pride as a man, and the love that Richard had betrayed. The child, too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, grew up with questions that Emma couldn't fully answer. As the years passed, he began to piece together fragments of the truth from the whispers that lingered like ghosts in Greenwood Hills. By the time he was old enough to confront Emma, she told him everything, sparing no detail. It was the hardest conversation she had ever had, but she owed him the truth. The boy, now a man, visited Greenwood Hills only once, to see the grave of the father who had loved him unconditionally, despite everything. Standing there, he felt the weight of his mother's mistakes, his grandfather's betrayal, and his own identity. Yet, as he read the words etched into Ethan's headstone, beloved husband, father, and son, forever loved, he made a decision. The past, he realized, was a chain, but it didn't have to define him. He could honor Ethan's love and learn from the tragedy that had shaped his family. He would not let the mistakes of one generation destroy another. The tragedy of Ethan Miller's life was not just in the betrayal he endured, but in the silence that surrounded it. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of unraveling, leaving destruction in their wake. Yet, within the darkness of this story lies a lesson, a reminder that love, trust, and truth are fragile but essential bonds. For Emma, the lesson came too late. For Richard, it came at an unbearable cost. But for the boy who carried their legacy, it became a chance to rebuild, to find hope amidst the ruins. The scars of their choices would never fully heal, but they stood as a testament, a warning that even the smallest actions can ripple outward, changing lives forever. And for Greenwood Hills, the story of the Millers would linger long after the whispers faded, a cautionary tale etched into the very fabric of the town. Years passed, and the story of the Miller family became more of a whispered memory than an active topic in Greenwood Hills. The auto shop remained closed, its sign faded and weather-worn, a silent monument to Richard's retreat from the world. The once bustling house on the edge of town stood empty, its windows dark and its garden overgrown, as if nature itself sought to reclaim the space where so much pain had unfolded. Emma, now living in Los Angeles, built a quiet life for herself and her son. She never remarried, carrying the weight of her past choices like a shadow she could never outrun. Her son, now a young man, grew up surrounded by his mother's quiet strength but also her lingering sadness. Though she gave him all the love and support she could muster, he often felt a gap, a space where his father should have been, where answers should have existed. When he turned 18, Emma sat him down and told him everything. She held nothing back, the affair, the lies, the betrayal that had broken their family apart. Her voice cracked as she admitted the role she had played in Ethan's suffering, and tears fell as she described the man Ethan had been, the love he had shown despite everything. Her son listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, he stood and walked out of the room, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts and fears. Hours later, he returned, his eyes red but his expression calm. "I want to see him," he said simply. Emma knew exactly what he meant. Within days, they were back in Greenwood Hills, standing in the small cemetery where Ethan was buried. The town felt frozen in time, unchanged since they had left, though the weight of its history pressed heavily on Emma as she led her son to his father's grave. The headstone was simple but elegant, etched with the words, Ethan Miller. Beloved husband, father, and son. Forever loved. Her son stood silently for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the inscription. Emma watched him from a distance, her heart pounding with the fear of what he might say or feel. She wanted to comfort him, but she knew this was a moment he needed to face on his own. Finally, he knelt, placing a hand on the cold stone. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. I wish I could have known you. Emma's tears spilled over as she heard the words. It was a moment of closure she had feared might never come. Her son stood, turned to her, and said something that would stay with her forever. I forgive you, Mom. And I forgive him. But I won't let this define me. Years later, her son returned to Greenwood Hills one final time. This time, he came alone, carrying a notebook filled with memories, letters, and his own reflections. Sitting in the small park near the auto shop, he began to write the story of his family, not to condemn, but to understand. He wrote about Ethan's quiet strength, Richard's weakness, and Emma's longing for connection. He wrote about love, betrayal, and the fragile bonds that hold families together. But most importantly, he wrote about the lessons he had learned, that love, even when flawed, is still worth something, that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, but it can pave the way for healing. The ending of his story remained open, like the wounds his family carried. He didn't write about happy endings, nor did he write about complete resolutions. Instead, he left the final words for the reader to decide. We are all imperfect. We all make mistakes. But what matters most is what we choose to do after. Do we repeat the sins of the past, or do we find the courage to break free? The Miller family's story is a cautionary tale, but it is also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their lives were marked by pain and loss, but also by love and forgiveness. The choices they made left scars, but those scars told a story of survival, of finding meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. For Emma, the lesson was in the price of honesty and the weight of deception. For Richard, it was the devastating consequences of letting loneliness guide his actions. For their son, it was the power of forgiveness and the strength to build a better future. And for us, as witnesses to their story, the lesson is clear: the bonds of trust and love are precious, but fragile. They must be nurtured, protected, and honored, or they risk being shattered beyond repair. What do you think of the Miller family's story? Could Emma and Richard have made different choices, or was the tragedy inevitable? What would you have done if you were in Ethan's position? Or Emma's? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. And if you believe this story carries a lesson worth sharing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others. Do you think forgiveness can truly heal such deep wounds? Or do some betrayals leave scars that never fully fade? Join the conversation, and let's reflect on what this story teaches us about love, trust, and the power of truth.